We have today here Anil Markandya, research professor at the Basque Center of Climate Change. He's one of the most respected economists working on climate change. His research has helped to know how to address climate change from mitigation and adaptation. So thank you very much, Anil.
Thank you very much for inviting me to this very important and impressive audience. I feel a little bit overwhelmed by the quality of the people that I'm facing. But let me start by making a couple of general remarks. One is that my presentation is much in the nature of an overview of the issues involved in climate change, but particularly, and you will see much more detail on the analytical issues involved in the forthcoming presentations. And the second is that I was asked to look at climate change in the wider context of the planetary crisis in which climate is looked at in conjunction with the issues of biodiversity loss and pollution, because these things are not independent and, in a sense, dealing with one and not taking account of the interactions of the others will be to our detriment. So let me start. Why is this not working? Am I pressing the wrong thing? Or? Sorry, can somebody help me? I'm afraid I need someone to help change the slides. Okay, so there's the outline of what I'm going to say. What is sustainable finance? We all have views about it. I'll talk quite a bit about the flows of finance for climate risk and the related planetary challenges. Some estimates of the finance needs to address climate risk and the other planetary challenges of biodiversity and pollution. Ways in which more finance can be mobilized to fill the gaps. Some of the synergies and trade-offs between the challenges, and then areas for research and further development. Am I pressing the So what do I understand by sustainable finance? Well, I view it as finance that meets the requirements to manage climate risk in an efficient and equitable way, and that at the same time it's finance that recognizes the links between climate and other planetary challenges of biodiversity loss and pollution. There are other opinions, of course, which may be relevant, but these, I think, are some of the key aspects that we have to focus on. So good. Is it doing this? So I'm going to discuss finance for actions to mitigate climate impacts and to adapt to climate change. Some of the finance we need to reduce biodiversity loss, and then finance for actions to reduce pollution and the impacts of pollution, and some of the links between the flows for these objectives. The planetary crisis, there are significant synergies and trade-offs. In this slide, I just show you some of the important ones. And if we deal with climate change, we also have issues linked to air pollution, biodiversity, where some of us are quite familiar with these, but just the increase in local air pollutants from fossil fuel combustion and the reduction in those can often significantly lower the costs of making the transition. And in terms of biodiversity, climate change could overtake land use change as the leading cause cause of biodiversity loss by 2070. Wildfires are increasing the cause of loss of forests, and climate change is affecting and will continue to affect all forests, especially tropical forests. A key indicator of biodiversity is mean species abundance, and this is declining with temperature rise. The use of wood for energy is still an important source of deforestation in some hotspots. And the changing climate is altering marine biomes, including systems such as coral reefs. With regard to biodiversity and its impacts on climate change and pollution, biodiversity has huge implications for climate change. Enormous amounts of carbon are locked within animal life and vegetation. The Amazon contains carbon equivalent to a decade of global human emissions. Biodiversity loss reduces the capacity of the biosphere to absorb waste. And then, regard to pollution and its links to climate change and biodiversity, the discharge of pollutants contributes to the depreciation of the biosphere. Acid rain damages forests, lakes, rivers, estuaries, and coastal waters. Coastal waters suffer from eutrophication when subjected to overload of nutrients. The one issue which sometimes goes the other way is that emissions of sulfur can reduce the impacts of greenhouse gases on temperature, and efforts to reduce them may actually increase the temperature. So just looking at first finance for mitigation and adaptation, these are global figures, and climate finance seeks to reduce greenhouse gases that determine climate change and reduce the impacts of such change through adaptation. The estimates in the literature suggest that at least $6.3 trillion in annual climate finance will be needed from 2024 to 2030 to avoid the worst impacts of climate change. Current finance for mitigation and adaptation is estimated around $1.9 trillion, made up 93% for mitigation and about 3% for adaptation. The rest is a mixture of the two. So we have a major gap to fill. Climate, as I said, reached 1.9 trillion in 2023, but it has been rising quite sharply, so it went up about 134% since 2018. And this includes investment in various mitigation, energy, transport, buildings, and infrastructure. As I said, most of it was for mitigation, and of the mitigation, about 1/3 was public, about 2/3 was private. So in that sense, we are seeing a significant amount of expenditure coming from private sources. But amounts are still far short of needs. And just to give you an indication of how these are really quite large figures, it's between 4.4 and 8 trillion more a year. This equals to about between 8 and 18% of all direct investment positions globally. So we are really looking at a massive scaling up if we are to achieve these targets. How can we do this? Well, these are issues which will be discussed in more detail in the coming talks, but here are a few points. Amounts going to fossil fuel production and distribution are still large, about 1.2 trillion in 2024. At present, low-carbon energy supply accounts for only 4% of global listed equity, compared to 10% for fossil fuel supply. Banks continue to finance fossil fuel supply heavily, with an estimated 1 trillion allocated in 2022, compared to 7.7 trillion for low-carbon energy. Fiscal incentives for switching to low carbon in the form of carbon pricing are still low, and regulations for net zero are facing significant pushback. At present, only about 3.2% of emissions are priced at or above the recommended level, and only 28% of emissions globally are covered by any pricing. But at the same time, we have some positive trends as well, some good news. Costs of key clean technologies continue to fall rapidly, making them competitive. The IEA's Clean Energy Equipment Price Index hit a record low in early 2024, a 60% fall compared to 10 years ago. Solar, wind, and solar panel wind turbine prices down 60% and 50% since 2022, and much more if you go back another decade. But costs of grid materials have doubled in the last 5 years as a result of the demand for cables and transformers, raising infrastructure costs. Intermittency with renewables is an issue, but costs of battery storage are declining fast and declined 93% since 2010. And also intermittency can be more addressed through better connected grids and through variable electricity pricing. And these tools are still have much greater potential than has been realized. What can we do more to make the mitigation more effective? Well, central banks can adopt climate-related prudential policies related to risk management supervision. We'll hear more detail about that later. But only 41 central banks have done so by 2023. These prudential policies make finance institutions take account of climate risks of fossil fuel investment and others through sectoral capital requirements, Brown penalizing factors, and climate-related stress tests for loans. Many of these instruments have been evaluated more in a conceptual or modeling sense, but the one for which we actually have empirical evidence is that climate-related stress tests do have an impact in terms of the flow of finance to clean energy. And governments can mandate disclosures that relate to impacts on emissions and the resilience of loans, and introduce policies incentivizing the financial flows going to climate misaligned activities. And very importantly, we can collect and make public, to the extent possible, detailed data on finance exposed to activities contributing to or undermining climate goals. And this, as we were discussing last night, can be done at a very local level to be really effective and in a much more user-friendly way than is sometimes the case. Let me turn to the climate finance for adaptation, where the number of points we should all be aware of. Firstly, the amounts involved are much smaller than mitigation. About 123 billion globally was the figure, compared to 1.7 trillion or 1.8 trillion for mitigation. The flows for adaptation in developing countries are around 26 billion, compared to estimated needs that are maybe 10 to 12 times that figure. This is according to the UNEP Adaptation Gap Report. In Western Europe, total investment for adaptation was about 13 billion in 2023. A study estimates the needs of the EU, which is not the same as Western Europe, at around 70 billion to 2050 a year, 70 billion a year. So even there we have quite a big gap which needs to be filled. Here the private sector accounts for very little of the measured expenditure on adaptation, about 5%. Even in high-income countries. In developing countries, it's predominantly international and public finance. In 2022, it was almost 100% for least developing countries, and for the emerging market economies, it's still 97%. And international public finance has declined since 2022, and further declines are expected, so we have even bigger gaps to fill. So how can we increase adaptation finance? What things can we do? Well, more private sector investment has been identified as being possible, especially in the areas of agriculture, water use and infrastructure, but projects often need public engagement. He estimates how that about 15 or 20% of adaptation can be met in this way. In developing countries, the public sector's role of de-risking the investment and providing leverage is very important. Then some way of linking finance in the sense of where the funds come from versus funding as to who pays for the investments, these are linked, and if we can link them more so that more finance can be raised by mobilizing the funding sources through measures such as charging for land value enhancement or creating an increased resilience to the beneficiaries, this will be a way to increase investment more effectively. At present, a lot of the so-called adaptation finance is ex post after the event has occurred, and it generally comes from public sources. Green bond issuances are increasing, a growing source. Again, public is about 3/4 of that. And a shift to dual-purpose finance may be something to look at, because finance that combines mitigation and adaptation is a fast-growing channel for adaptation finance. And here, a follow this agriculture, forest and land use, forest, water and waste are key sectors where complementarity exists and where it is playing an increasing role. So let me now turn to the other areas of finance, which are biodiversity loss. And here the biodiversity framework is the main source which aims to, it has many targets, but one of the key ones is to halt and reverse biodiversity loss by 2030 and restore 30% of degraded areas. The finance target is to increase finance for biodiversity actions and strategies to about 200 billion by 2030. And the OECD estimates current finance from all sources about 77 to 87 billion. So again, quite a significant gap here. The problem here is that biodiversity is hard to finance because it is a public good. It is underprovided by the market. There are significant free rider problems. And there's a global subsidy in biodiversity protection because it's from the biodiversity rich to the financially rich. A large amount of the biodiversity is in the global south. And there are issues of coordination problems. What does the evidence indicate to us about monetizing biodiversity? Well, we have quite a lot. It's mixed. And on this slide is a way of summarizing it. On the vertical axis, I've got different forms of interventions in engagement. Some are voluntary, going up, and those which are compliance-related going down. And on the horizontal axis, we have measures which are private on the left and public on the right. So a combination of voluntary and private are important in ways in which we reflect through offsets, ecotourism, trophy hunting, and land values. These are for targeted biodiversity gain. They have some chance, they have been shown to work, and I'll give some examples. But the geographical scale is small, global impact is small, and the volumes of money involved are still small. Looking at the private sector engaged with compliance, here we have taxes, permit system schemes, offsets, which are required, mandated offsets, and legal liability. And here again, we've seen some gain being observed, and some attempts to temper the net bad subsidies, but the evidence is still mixed. And this is an area also where we need more research. And then between the voluntary and the public, combined, we have the debt for nature swaps, green bonds, and payment for environmental services. And here the picture is mixed. The political priorities have been low, although there's been some shift recently, and the potential gains could be quite significant. And then lastly, we have the public sector and compliance, where we have infrastructure standards, trade agreements, international treaties and tide aid, where we've got a significant issue of enforcement and coordination, although potential biodiversity gains could be quite large. So in terms of the private sector biodiversity finance, we were talking about this last night, we've got significant schemes in place in the US and Western Europe, where it allows developers to offset any impacts by buying an equivalent habitat and protecting it. But there have been some attempts to engage emerging markets, but there are still significant issues, especially in terms of equivalency. Are we getting like for like when we protect? Biodiversity credits is an area where you get a voluntary purchase of a credit to ensure biodiversity protection of a parcel of land, or guarantee an increase in biodiversity through restoration. And here the issues are, because biodiversity is a multi-dimensional issue, what metrics do we have? And because we have several metrics, trading is quite difficult. So biodiversity offset schemes are mobilizing quite significant amounts, about 6 to 9 billion annually, but biodiversity credits have very little trading, and the associated investment biodiversity outcomes is still very small. Of that 6 to 9 billion, only about 8 billion is actually for investment in biodiversity outcomes. And then we have some scope for linking biodiversity to carbon credits, and here we have there is a growing market where if you have a carbon credit where you can identify biodiversity co-benefits, then that can get you a premium. And so there's about 2 billion of the voluntary carbon market includes that. So despite recent growth, the supply of such credits is small. To increase the market will require further use of natural capital accounting to standardize biodiversity measures and adopt a common methodology. We also have a long-standing REDD+ program, which bundles carbon reductions with other targets, but these have been linked to the voluntary carbon market, and they are the largest volume. But the problems in acceptance remain, and credits issues have declined sharply since 2021 to 2024, as the criteria have tightened. And then the role of the public sector has to remain, I think, has to be significant in the coming years. Public sources are critical, and much of the biodiversity is located in poor countries and is a public good, global public good. So public finance can provide proof of concept and leverage private flows. And examples include green, social, sustainable, and sustainability-linked bonds. These are a new asset class where use is tied to key performance indicators such as restoring wetlands, protecting forests, and reducing threats to wildlife and plant species. The amount raised was about 980 billion in 2023, but only 10 billion of that actually financed biodiversity. Debt conversions for nature swaps, which went out of fashion, have coming back a little bit with some support from the IMF, where these reduced debt obligations in exchange for committing freed up finance toward domestic nature projects. Examples include Seychelles, Belize, and Cabo Verde in recent years. Other sources of biodiversity finance include wildlife conservation bonds, where the bond has a World Bank rating, and at the end of the life of the bond, investors get back the principal along with a variable pay depending on the population growth of the black rhino. Blended finance, where global public finance invest equity on a first loss basis to crowd in private investment. The example of the Global Fund for Coral Reefs uses 125 million on this basis to protect coral reef investment in, to protect the investment in sustainable ocean production, ecosystem, and sustainable infrastructure. Almost the same amount has been raised from private sources. Let me now turn to the third component of the planetary crisis, which is pollution prevention, management, and finance. Now here, unlike for climate change and biodiversity, there is no integrated planning and reporting framework. National pollution control and management policy is set by a set of disparate policies and plans developed in response to different priorities and multilateral environmental agreements. These target various environmental sinks like air and pollutants, hazardous chemicals, across different life cycle stages. The OECD has recommended quite recently, quite strongly, developing national plans to tackle pollution comparable to those available for climate change and biodiversity. This may be conducive to the identification of policy gaps as well as opportunities for synergies and risks of trade-off. There is also no comparison of financing pollution like I gave for and the gaps for climate and biodiversity for pollution. But there are some figures for the EU. I'd like to share those. And the EU aims to meet its 2050 zero pollution goals by bringing down pollution to levels that are no longer harmful to the environment and human health. To achieve this goal by 2050, the EU needs important milestones along the road. By 2030, this will require around 76 billion in EU investments. The significant the current investment gap of approximately 40 billion is expected to be filled largely by private investments and additional measures through national energy and climate plans. These are some of the figures showing you the finance gaps and you see the biggest ones. The blue one is the total needs, and the yellow one is the gap. The gaps are the biggest for air quality, but there are also, which is quite strongly linked to climate change, but there are also significant gaps for noise, soil, wastewater, and some for higher circularity measures. These are the numbers for individual countries. I don't think I'll go much further. So each country in the EU, the gaps, the financing gaps are still quite significant for pollution. And again, tying these to climate and to biodiversity would be a way of addressing them. And the finance for zero pollution target, just 46% of investment needs for pollution control are being currently met. And private funds are expected to account for a significant share of investments going forward, along with increased efforts by EU member states, partly through in-country resources and partly through EU funding, such as through the National Energy and Climate Plan. So easily understandable disclosures, well-introduced green bond standards, and incorporation for environmental, social, and governance elements into the ratings of corporations will help. And reductions of fossil fuel subsidies will help to meet the zero pollution goal, will also contribute, of course, to climate change. And these are just the figures put together. I tried to bring together for the EU the current needs, the current expenditure and gap for mitigation, adaptation, pollution prevention, biodiversity in the total. And you can see the gap is about 519 billion. And at the moment, the public gap is about 207, the private about 312. This is some analysis that I did. But just to give you an idea of what the figures are like, takes up about the gap is about 1.1% of GDP for the public sector, for all of these sources, 1.6 for the private. And as a percentage of EU investment, that 30% of the public investment would be the increase needed, which is huge, and 8.4% in the case of the private sector. So we've got a big scaling up problem, and we've got to find a way of shifting from the public to the private. So these are my last key messages. I hope I'm not taking too much time. The financing needs for meeting climate change, biodiversity, and pollution prevention are significant across all countries. Climate change mitigation has the largest requirements and needs to go up at least threefold. The good news is that private investment in low carbon is increasing fast. Incentives to reflect risks for fossil fuel investment and support renewables can speed up this process. Adaptation to climate change has lower finance requirements but depends significantly on the public sector, and the gap is greater than for mitigation, especially in developing countries. Increasing the private sector's role is possible to a limited extent, but needs concerted action through blended finance and the use of dual-purpose programs. The needs for biodiversity conservation are more than double actual flows. The expenditures are needed most in biodiversity countries, rich countries, which are mostly in the global south. Most finance needs to come, most of it will have to come from public sources, but there is a potential for private sector through various instruments. Pollution prevention is not tracked globally in an integrated manner, and this gap needs to be addressed. Finance gaps for all three areas in the EU are significant and will place a burden on the public sector especially. Scope for a shift of finance is possible, and instruments for this, we've discussed them, but you will hear more in the other talks. There is a gap in identifying synergies and trade-offs when designing programs. This is also an area where action is needed. Thank you.
Questions from the audience? If not, just...
Stefano Battistone, University of Foscari, Venice. So, Professor Markandya, thank you so much. It was a fantastic presentation. I wonder if you have any insight on how one can resolve one of the issues that you mentioned. So, in the case, for instance, of the Rhino bond, in general, biodiversity is a public good. So, in order to bring in private investors, somehow you need to for the public finance institution to recognize the positive externalities,
yes,
and somehow account it for them. And then when this is happening, then it would be willing to pay for the reward on the financial instruments. Do you have insights on how this could happen better?
Well, not more than what we've already seen, that there are a few attempts at this to crowd in the private investment by offering, in some cases, a first loss basis for the equity that the public sector puts in such cases, to say, well, if the thing fails, then we will take the loss, and to recognize that there are targets that we want to meet, and the payout is variable depending on how successful we are in meeting those targets. But it's still, there are a lot of these things are exciting, but the whole issue is that the amount of scaling up we need is frightening, because we need to do so much more.